Hello, children. Welcome to my class. Let us read lesson 10 Fear You Are Gone. Before reading the lesson, let's get started. I will ask you few questions. What are the things you are afraid of? And why are you frightened of these things? Did you ever try to overcome these fears? If yes, then how? Children, let's read the lesson. 10-year-old Susan was a timid girl. Since childhood, her elder brother Henry had been playing pranks on her. So she had started fearing nearly everything around her: fire, darkness, crowds, animals, insects, to name a few. She was even an easy target of the tricks of her friends. So, children, this lesson is about a 10-year-old little girl called Susan. She was a very shy girl. Her brother Henry used to play pranks. Pranks means practical jokes on her and made her scared. She started fearing fire, darkness, crowds, animals, insects, and she was an easy target by her friends' tricks. As time passed, she started believing that she was the only one in the world who could be frightened very easily. She started smiling less, eating less, and leaving the house only when it was necessary. She even stopped going out to play with her friends and was almost tied to her mother's apron strings. So, children, Susan started smiling less, eating less, and never likes to leave her house. She had stopped playing with her friends and remained by her mother's side all the time. Her mother, Mrs. Johnson, wanted her to overcome her fears. She wanted Susan to know that she was not the only one who had fears. In fact, we all have fears of our own, but it doesn't stop us from doing what we want to. So, children, Mrs. Johnson, she is the mother of Susan. She wanted Susan to overcome. Overcome means to make a control over her fears, and that all of us had fears, and one cannot sit at home, or it doesn't stop us from doing what we want to. One fine evening, Susan was sitting on the couch in the living room and reading a storybook. Mrs. Johnson thought it was the right moment to talk to her daughter about her fears. So, children, one day Susan was sitting on her couch, couch means sofa, and reading a storybook. This was the right time that Mrs. Johnson got a chance to talk to Susan about her fears. Why are you sitting alone, my child? Are you all right? Mrs. Johnson asked. Mom, I'm fine. I'm enjoying reading this book, Susan replied. Mrs. Johnson smiled, sat by her side, and said, Susan, I think you should be playing outside like other children in this fine weather. You hardly move out of the house after school. So, children, Mrs. Johnson started talking with Susan and insisted her to play outside with other children. But Susan was not convinced. She was feeling okay at home. Then Mrs. Johnson gently held her hand and asked her, What's the matter? Why do you fear going out? We all have fears, dear, but we overcome them. Do you know many great people had fears, but that did not stop them from achieving what they wanted to? So then her mother asked her about her fears and to overcome them. She told her that fears cannot stop us from achieving what we deserve. Susan put her book aside and looked at her mother curiously. Mrs. Johnson knew that was the best moment to tell her daughter about the fears with which famous people lived. She asked Susan, Have you heard the name of George Washington? So, children, Mrs. Johnson, she wanted to tell her daughter about the fears of famous people. She asked Susan about George Washington. Who hasn't, Mom? I know a lot about him. He was the first president of the United States of America. He commanded forces in many battles. He defended America against the British and risked his life to save others. So, children, Susan already knows about George Washington, the first president of United States of America, as he fought against the Britishers for America and put his life in danger to save others. Well, such a brave man had a serious fear of being buried alive. Oh, that's surprising, Mom. Now I'll tell you something about Richard Nixon, the 34th President of America. He had a fear of hospitals. He believed that if he were to ever go to hospital for treatment, he would never come back alive. In 1974, he suffered blood clot and refused to go to hospital. However, he was told if he didn't go, he would die. Did he go then? Of course he had to. The next on Mrs. Johnson's list was Natalie Wood, the actress. Susan, you know Natalie Wood, had a great fear of water. So, children, Mrs. Johnson told her that George Washington had a fear of being buried alive. Susan was surprised on hearing this. So, Mrs. Johnson continued telling Susan about other famous people. She told her about Richard Nixon, the 34th President of America, who had a fear of hospitals. He was afraid of going to hospital for any treatment because he had a fear that he would never come back alive from there. Then on the list was Natalie Wood, who was an actress and had a fear of water. Oh, really? So do I, Mom. Yes, it's true. It all began when Natalie's mother tricked her into standing on a bridge for a movie. The bridge had been prepared for Natalie to fall into the water. She was young then, and the fear of water stuck with her for life. Now, Susan was curious to know about Natalie. Children, did you know what Natalie's mother did? She didn't tell her about the bridge that had been made for the actress to fall into the water. Natalie was very young at that time, so after doing the scene, she started fearing from water. Susan looked quite interested. She had already started feeling brave. She wanted her mother to carry on, so Mrs. Johnson decided to talk about the powerful French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. And now, Napoleon Bonaparte? Mom, how could an emperor like him fear anything? After all, he was an emperor. On hearing this, Susan started feeling brave. She wanted her mother to tell something more about famous people, so her mother told her about the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Susan wondered how an emperor could fear anything. Mrs. Johnson told her that even Napoleon Bonaparte also had a fear. Well, he was a human like you or me, my child. Do you know what he feared? Cats. He panicked whenever he saw one, and it was not just Napoleon. Many other men who tried to rule the world, including Hitler, Mussolini, and Julius Caesar, feared cats. Children, do you know what Mrs. Johnson told Susan? She told her that Napoleon Bonaparte used to panic on seeing cats. Even Hitler, Mussolini, and Julius Caesar had a fear of cats. Susan had a hearty laugh. After hearing all that her mother said, Susan felt better. She understood that everyone has fears, even great people, but it is important that we overcome them. She promised her mother that she would once again go out and play with her friends and face her fears bravely. So, children, at the end, Susan laughed loudly. After hearing all this from her mother, she was feeling quite better now, and she understood that we all have fears, even famous people. But it is very important that we have to overcome our fears. So she promised her mother that she would once again go out to play with her friends and she would face her fears bravely. That's all in this chapter. I hope you enjoyed reading this chapter. Thank you and have a nice day.